Ohana Chapter 3. In the few weeks since Knuckles had come to live with the Wachowskis, things had been different. Well, not good nor bad different, just different. Maddie and Tom were learning to live with not one but three super-powered alien kids under their roof, learning their different wants and needs just like any other parent with human children. Learning to split their attention between the three was going to be a curveball, but one they were willing to try and catch. Sonic was clingy. Well, he didn't admit it, and being the first he did get a little jealous when they were paying attention to Tails or Knuckles or Ozzy or something came up at work that needed their attention. Tom had taken him fishing to try and get an answer out of him about his behavior, and had reported such back to Maddie when they came back with some lake trout. Sometimes his quills would spark with that familiar chotic energy, especially if he was taking his annoyance out on Knuckles, which either ended in an actual fight or verbal confrontation. Tails was neurodivergent. That much was clear to Maddie as they tried to get him to open up about his interests. He often talked about space, time, choose theory, robotics, anything, at a mile a minute, as though the humans understood what he was talking about, and they often found machines around the house tinkered with but put back together. The microwave didn't work for a couple of days and the Roomba suddenly had sentience. His side of the attic was adorned with glow-in-the-dark stars, a planetary mobile, and a bench space for tools and his latest gadgets. When it was his turn to choose something to watch, it was usually something educational, and he liked Neil deGrasse Tyson and old Carl Sagan documentaries. Knuckles. It was difficult to get Knuckles to open up. Maddie remembered being a teenager, the trials and tribulations of high school, but it was different when you were an alien teenager. They often didn't see him for hours at a time, but he had come to her one day asking if it was all right if he started tending to their garden. In the quietest of voices, his cheeks heated in embarrassment that he even needed to ask such a thing. It made sense that he liked working with his hands, given what she had Googled on echidnas one night curled up beside Tom when the kids had gone to bed. Earth echidnas were probably entirely different to Mobian echidnas though, right? The garden was starting to look healthier than it ever had, the ferns surrounding the property dripping morning dew in the sunlight. Maddie inhaled the crisp air as she stepped out onto the back balcony, Ozzy brushing past her to sniff new scents. Tom had taken Sonic and Tails to the baseball ground today, sensing the rise in energy between the two and encouraging them to engage in an activity that would exhaust it. It gave her the house to herself, Willow, herself and a certain red-furred teenager. Maddie rolled out the yoga mat she had been carrying under her arm and sat down cross-legged on it, turning on some soft music on her phone and quickly tying her hair up into a messy ponytail. Cupping her hands together in her lap, she straightened her shoulders, inhaled, and exhaled and closed her eyes. She heard Ozzy whine in the distance, the rustle of the trees, the distant honking of horns as the people of Green Hills went about their Yule day. The door opened in the distance, heavy with footfalls that had become familiar. Knuckles watched her in silence for a while, because she didn't hear him much after he stepped off the balcony, if only to the sound of the shed door opening. Emerald flashed under her eyelids and vanished just as quickly.
What are you doing?
It was so quiet she barely heard it, forcing her eyes to open and look at Knuckles. He stood a distance from her, his tail twitching, and purple eyes curious but tentative. Maddie watched him come a little closer before stopping himself, foot scuffing the ground as he pulled it back.
Meditating,
she replied, uncapping her hands and placing them on her knees.
with the boys out of the house, I thought it'd be the perfect time.
So is that what humans call it?
He tilted his head, blinking owlishly.
What does it do exactly?
Meditation is a practice to train attention and awareness and achieve mental clarity and a calm state of mind.
She explained, leaning forward a little on her seat on the ground.
I find it relaxing to do it outside.
My people have had a similar practice.
Maddie tried not to perk up at the newly divulged information, but happy that he was telling her something new. Knuckles drew a little closer again, looking at the area around them rather than at her.
It helps us connect to the earth and the master world.
You can join me if you want.
The offer was there if he chose to accept it. Maddie watched him think it over, pausing, before he shifted forward and sat down a few feet away from her, crossing his own legs. Knuckles looked at her expectantly, unsure of what to make of the human that had been nothing but kind to him since he showed up at her doorstep with Sonic. He had every reason not to trust humans, given that Robotnik was one of them, but the Wachowskis had given him somewhere to fall back to sleep if it was raining outside. Looking down at his hands, Knuckles closed his eyes and slowly began taking off his gloves. It took Maddie a second to realize she had never seen any of them without their gloves on. Like a comfort item, they kept their paws from being too exposed, and she realized Knuckles taking them off was a sign of trust. Her chest felt a little heavy at that prospect. His fingers were long, dark brown furred compared to the rest of him, the discoloration reaching towards his wrists, and on top of his hands were two thick spurs that sat in the pointed crook of his gloves. Knuckles saw her looking and his muzzle flushed, ducking his head, and picking up a glove that he just set down before she reached across to cup a hand of her own over his.
Don't.
Maddie gave him a kind smile.
They're beautiful, Knuckles.
He grumbled, the flush darkening as he pulled his hand away with a soft jerking motion so he didn't injure her with his spurs.
It's uncommon.
He gruffed out, looking down at his hands. His thumb ran along one of his spurs, gaze flicking to the ground.
Only my clan have them. We are warriors, designed to protect and help the community and the Master Emerald, my father.
He cleared his throat and looked away.
Never mind.
Maddie drew her hand back to herself and placed it in her lap with the other, understanding a little but at the same time full of questions about the red airline.
Shall we meditate then?
Knuckles returned his attention to her after half a minute, brow furrowed together before he blurted out.
Why are you so nice to me?
She blinked at him as he composed himself, hands fully in his lap and shoulders hunched as he looked uncomfortable.
I tried to kill your kid. I thought Robotnik was telling the truth and that he had stolen the Master Emerald. I pummeled him into the ground just over there.
He looked towards the spot where there was still an indent in the ground, rainwater creating a small pond.
Why are you so?
Because everyone deserves a chance.
Maddie remained in her position, as much as she wanted to rush forward and give him the biggest hug in the world, and made a mental note to kick Robotnik's butt later for damaging him so. He didn't trust himself not to hurt anyone, it was clear, and the way he looked down at his hands made her sad.
Believe it or not, I didn't know how to handle Sonic at first, and brings this word, blue alien thing to me and asked me to wake him up. How am I supposed to do that? I don't know alien biology.
She giggled a little at the incredulous look on his face when he glanced up at her.
But he's just a kid, so I blamed him instead. I know you're a big teenager and can take care of yourself, but you deserve compassion too, Knuckles, and a roof over your head and food on your plate. You're alone in this world, but you don't have to be.
Maddie tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, reaching out to him with an open palm.
We're here if you need us.
Knuckles looked at her, then at the offered hand, hesitating. He was fiercely independent. She knew that, and she respected that, and she knew he wouldn't probably ready for a family for a long time to come. Miles was easier, because he was young and impressionable, and had already firmly attached himself to Sonic's hip. But Knuckles, he kind of reminded her of her sister coming out of her past relationship, how Rachel had been prickly and easily aggravated and distrusting of people. He lifted his hand, pulled it back and looked away, before he let himself take hold of her, feeling the warmth of her palm against his. It had been a long time since he'd felt someone else's grip in his, without the buffer of his gloves, and it suddenly occurred to him how different humans were built from Mobians. They were fragile, but she seemed so strong. He respected that. Knuckles looked at their joined hands, then at her.
Would you like to feel something?
The question made Maddie blank.
Sure.
Knuckles watched her for a moment before he relaxed his muscles, shifted forward so he wasn't leaning so far, and rested his other hand on the ground beside him. Maddie felt a tingle go up her spine, realizing that his hands were sparking but not dangerously. She watched the red lightning before returning her attention to him and, seeing his eyes closed, she did the same. The earth seemed to come up from underneath them. The sensation of rumbling running along the skin of her arms. Birds were suddenly louder. The sound of footsteps echoing in her ears. A bear's growl in the distance. The rush of a stream of water. It was the planet, all condensed into one feeling, one sound, one motion. She could feel rocks crumble from a cliff, the noise of people chattering in multiple language, the sound of a whale's echoing moan. Maddie broke their concentration by drawing back, a small gasp for breath leaving her as she faltered, looking at him as he opened his eyes.
What was that?
But she knew the answer.
Your planet.
He looked calm as she composed herself, drawing his hand back to his knee and pursing his lips together.
Goodness, I can feel it. The motion of the core, the untapped jazz energy. It feels it's large, broken in places, but it loves you, her creations, so much.
Maddie looked down at her fingers, then at him.
And you feel this all the time?
Knuckles shrugged, tilting his head, and looking at his own hands.
We are naturally attuned to the ground, the earth, and the Master Emerald atones that. It's
A lot.
They both said it at the same time, and some part of Maddie felt like she had unlocked a part of her companion. She gave him a small smile, reaching over to cup her hand over his again.
How about we just concentrate on one thing at a time, huh? I can teach you how to block it out, if you'd like.
The Echidna smiled, perhaps the first genuine smile she'd seen from him.
I'd like that.
One mystery down, more to solve.